Hello, welcome to Unit 7 of Modern Western Civilization. In Unit 6, we saw how absolutism, pioneered in France, became the dominant form of government during the 17th and 18th centuries. We also briefly discussed the course of the Second Hundred Years' War that took place in a Europe that was largely dominated by states where absolutist forms of government prevailed. As you know by now, the two nations whose antagonism drove that protracted conflict were France and Britain. Now, although it would be wrong to say that the two fought one another over ideological differences, it is necessary to note that by the end of the 17th century, as the Anglo-French struggle got underway, their styles of government were beginning to differ markedly. France, to be sure, was absolutist. Indeed, she was the very model of an absolutist state. But England, soon to merge with Scotland to become Great Britain in the 1707 Act of Union, had chosen another path, an often tortuous path, as we shall see. It had chosen a path that led to a form of government in which kings and governments are subject to the law, not above it. While this radical idea was not entirely new in the 17th century, its implementation on such a large scale was. First in the Dutch Republic, then somewhat later in England. The idea that states should be governed by laws as opposed to the arbitrary whims of rulers is known as constitutionalism, and its theory and practice will be the focus of this and the next three lectures. Anyone who knows the first thing about the history of the United States will, I'm sure, quickly surmise that it formed the basis of this nation's government. While Poland had pioneered a form of limited kingship as early as the 16th century, it was in England that constitutional monarchy achieved its apogee. In Poland, it had led to unprecedented levels of political freedom and religious toleration at a time when Western Europe was mired in the wars of religion. But it also contributed to a weakening of the Polish state that led to the dismemberment of Poland at the end of the 18th century by her more powerful neighbours. But in England, constitutionalism endured and left a lasting legacy that was later inherited by those nations, including the United States of America, that had the good fortune, or misfortune, depending on your point of view, of belonging at one time or another to the British Empire. Before we turn our attention to England, which will occupy us for the three lectures that follow this one, we must spend some time looking at that other great exception to the absolutist rule during the early modern period, the Dutch Republic. Even before receiving international recognition as an independent nation in 1648, the remarkable Dutch Republic had enjoyed levels of affluence and personal liberty that were unknown anywhere else in the world. And after winning her independence from Spain, she entered into what can only be described as a golden age of prosperity and artistic achievement. This was all the more remarkable given that the Dutch had just fought an 80-year war with the Spanish in order to secure their place among the nations of the world. Thus, the question must be asked, what was it about the Dutch or their way of life that enabled them to create a new and vibrant society that arguably became Europe's most desirable place to live during the 17th century and well into the 18th? Now, in answering this question, it is impossible to ignore the manner in which the Dutch governed themselves. Bucking the absolutist trend of the times, the Dutch Republic practiced a radical form of decentralized federalism. As we saw in a previous lecture, the Dutch Republic, also called the United Provinces, comprised 7 provinces whose delegates met from time to time in a federal States General, but remained beholden to the provincial assemblies whence they came. While the individual provinces enjoyed considerable autonomy, in times of war or other national emergencies, an office holder known as a stadtholder would be chosen to lead the nation as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Theoretically, the stadtholders were freely chosen and subordinate to the provincial assemblies. But in practice, at least from the time of William the Silent onwards, stadtholders were always chosen from the House of Orange. In other words, the position of stadtholder became hereditary. Nevertheless, in its avoidance of arbitrary power and in its embrace of federalism, the Dutch Constitution influenced the founding fathers of the United States, a fact acknowledged by James Madison in the Federalist Papers. Besides its decentralized system of government, another factor that contributed to the Dutch Golden Age was foreign trade. In fact, Holland emerged from the 30 Years' War as the world's greatest trading nation and the possessor of its largest merchant fleet. Holland, or so it seems, traded everywhere and with anyone who possessed the currency or goods to exchange for Dutch merchandise. Holland grew rich as a result of its mercantile preeminence, very rich in fact. As early as 1600, Amsterdam had replaced Antwerp as Europe's busiest port and centre of international banking and finance, with Dutch interest rates being the lowest anywhere, half the standard rate to be obtained in London. Dutch industry also thrived, and goods manufactured in Holland became a byword for innovation, excellence, and reliability. Now, areas where the Dutch excelled included the finishing of raw materials, furniture and paper making, sugar refining, brewing, printing, processing tobacco, fine fabrics, glassware, pottery, armaments, and shipbuilding, in which they led the world. Avoiding the extremes of mercantilism, however, the Dutch encouraged competition and allowed for levels of free enterprise unknown elsewhere, helping make 17th century Holland the most prosperous nation in Europe. As is so often the case when people are free economically, other freedoms follow. In Holland's case, those freedoms included a degree of religious liberty that was found nowhere else in Europe. Thus, while the majority of the Dutch adhered to traditional Calvinism, men and women of other religions were allowed to worship relatively freely. Now, these included Catholics, Jews, and so-called Arminians, who took their theology from Jacobus Arminius, a Dutch theologian who rejected double predestination and reaffirmed the role played by free will in the affairs of man. While religious minorities did not always enjoy the same rights as Calvinists, they enjoyed a freedom of worship in Holland that few of their co-religionists enjoyed elsewhere. Now, this climate of tolerance also nurtured the growth of publishing. At a time when books were being proscribed throughout Europe, Dutch authorities allowed books about religion, science, and philosophy to be printed that would have been banned in other jurisdictions. One who flourished, breathing the free air of Holland, was the French philosopher René Descartes. Writing to a friend about Amsterdam, he asked, "What other place in the world would one choose where all the commodities of life and all the curiosities to be desired are as easy to come by as here? What other land where one could enjoy such a complete freedom?" Well, I doubt he was alone in feeling this way. To paraphrase the art historian John Ruskin, great nations reveal more about themselves through what he called the book of their art than in any other way. And it is, of course, art, especially painting, that springs so readily to mind when we think of the Golden Age of Holland. Building on the magnificent legacy of early Netherlandish painters like Van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden that had made Flemish art the equal to anything produced in Italy during the Renaissance, Golden Age Dutch painters such as Frans Hals, Jan Steen, Jan Vermeer, and of course Rembrandt van Rijn produce works of virtuosic brilliance and enduring beauty. These and many others, too numerous to name here, excelled in all types of paintings, from still lifes to portraits, from sea and landscapes to so-called genre paintings, which depict ordinary people in everyday contemporary situations. Nature is celebrated, but it is not idealized. Similarly, men and women are depicted as noble creatures made in the image of God, but also as flawed and subject to original sin. Vermeer's Girl with the Pearl Earring, for example, depicts a young woman of considerable beauty and innate dignity, but she is a real girl made of flesh and blood, and there is nothing ethereal or imagined about her. Despite rejoicing in the joys of this life, magnificent religious art continued to be produced. Rembrandt's profoundly moving The Return of the Prodigal Son and the Deposition from the Cross being among the greatest examples. Now, without wishing to resort to cliches, Dutch 17th century painting scaled heights that have been equaled but never surpassed. To understand the greatness of Dutch civilization, ladies and gentlemen, one can do no better than to experience it through its glorious art. Thank you very much indeed.